Hi there, hello, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Machiavelli's Discourses. Today we're looking at chapter 21 of the Discourses. Again, we're all examining book 2 still, we're in book 2, so we're looking at chapter 21, which deals with, the title will be right there, the first praetor the Romans sent any place was to Caputa for 400 years after they began to make war. In other words, 400 years after they began to make war, they sent a praetor. The praetor is an official that was sent there. So let's go talk about this. How different the Romans were in their mode of proceeding in acquiescing from those who in the present time expand their jurisdiction had been very much discoursed above, right? So therefore he deals with this at Discourses 2:4, right? This is also that they led those towns they did not demolish, live under their own laws. Even those that surrendered not as partners but as subjects, even the ones, in other words, even the places they made as subjects, they allowed them to live under their laws. They did not leave in them any signs of the empire of the Roman people, but obliged them to some conditions, which, if observed, it kept them in their state, in dignity. In other words, they didn't impose on them some sign of this, or they just said, you just follow these rules and do these things, don't do that, leave you alone. These modes were known to have been observed until they went out of Italy and began to reduce kingdoms and states into provinces. In other words, these ways of doing this among the Romans, Italians, was one way, but then when they went to places outside of Italy, they began to reduce kingdoms and provinces. There was no clear example of this than that the first praetor sent by them to any place was to Caputa, which they sent there not from their ambitions, but because they were asked by the Capuchins, who, since there was discord among them, judged it necessary to have a Roman citizen inside the city who would reorder and reunite them. In other words, they couldn't be ruled by themselves. In other words, the present example is not because of the ambitions of the Romans, but because of the inability of the Capuchins to govern themselves. They asked a Roman to be sent there to help order them. In other words, a Roman citizen inside the city who would reorder and unite them. Moved by this example and constrained by the same necessity, the incenti who also asked for them for a prefect, right? This is Livy 8:11, right? This is even moved by the previous example. The Capuchins were moved, asked them to do this. Thus, Titus Livy says about this accident in this new mode of ruling. For now, not only Roman arms, but laws prevail. So in other words, not only their arms, but also their laws. Their laws were seen as so good, and their things that they would, in other words, the Capuchins said, we can't govern ourselves. So come and exercise authority over us. Solve our disputes for us, help unite us. And likewise, the Azanti did the similar thing, right? And that, therefore, not only Roman arms, but one sees, therefore, how much this mode made Rome increase easily. So that it was not only the arms of Rome, but the laws of Rome that made them understandable. And this is not soft power. Laws are not soft power. Laws are as much hard power as anything else. So therefore, it was not only, in other words, hard power is not merely arms. It is the mode of ordering, self-ruling, the laws. And this is very interesting here. And this leads us to rethink the chapter in The Prince where he says that, arms and laws are connected. Good arms and good laws are connected. Remember that very weird chapter in The Prince, how he argues. So therefore he ignores the discussion of laws. But now he brings up the discussion of laws to some degree. One sees that how much this mode made Rome increase easily. For those cities, especially those living under, those cities that were used to living freely or accustomed to being governed by those of their own province, remain content more quietly under a dominion than under a dominion they do not see, even though it may have in itself some hardships. That under one they see every day that appears to them to reprove them every day for their servitude. In other words, the Romans left into their own things. The cities that can govern themselves, long as they didn't do certain things and did not, agreed to certain agreements with the Romans let them be. They didn't put them under the servitude. And they would not be there. In other words, they don't see the hardship. In other words, under a dominion they do not see, even though it may have in itself some hardship, right? Then under one they see every day and reproves them. There follows closely from this another good for the prince. Since the ministers do not have in hand the judges and magistrates who render civil or criminal justice, in those cities. In other words, here, reasons, right? Criminal justice, reasons, right? This is where the literal word is criminal reasons. In those render civil or criminal reasons, and it says justice, in those cities, there can never arise a judgment. Now this is a sentence. Rise a sentence with disapproval of infamy for the prince. And this way, many causes of calumny and hatred towards him are lacking. So in other words, his ministers do not have in hand the judgments and magistrates of those who render civil justice in those cities. There can never arise, things that prove a calumny for the prince, the ruler. So that's what he says about that. In other words, that they themselves are local there. It's not my fault. In other words, if they're under their own laws and under their own decisions, it's not my guy doing it, and therefore if they do make bad mistakes, it's not my fault. Okay, that's what he's saying in that sense. It's their own fault. To see that this is true, besides the ancient examples of it that could be brought up, there is a fresh example of it, and it's Italy. For everyone knows Genoa having often been seized by the French. The king has always, except in the present time, sent a French governor who governs in his name. At present alone, not by the king's choice, but because necessity has ordered it thus. He has let the city to be governed by itself and by a Genoese governor. Okay. The French king is Francis I, the Genoese governor is Ottavio Fregoso, right? In other words, the example of this, in other words, he was done out of necessity. In that sense, he did it, let them do it. He normally sent a governor, but that's, without doubt, whoever seeks which of these two modes brings more security to the king of his rule over it, the more contentment to the populace. One would, without doubt, approve this last mode. In other words, the king had less. Once he sent his governor there, it was always his fault. More resistance towards him. But now he let them do it, govern himself, their own person, elected, coming from them. It's easier. He maintains it easier, he says, right? Besides this, men fling themselves into your laps so much more, the more you appear adverse from seizing them. And they fear you so much less on account of their freedom, the more you are humane and tame with them. In other words, he's saying that they will submit to you. In other words, liberality is a better policy of conquering than negative means. In other words, you don't make them submit. And because you're not going to dominate them and make them submit, they will get into your lap. And in other words, the more attentive to the populace, in other words, men fling themselves into your lap so much more when you appeared adverse to seizing them. And they fear you much less on account of their freedom, the more you are humane and tame with them. This tameness and liberality made the Capuchins run to the Romans to ask for a praetor. And if the Romans had demonstrated the least wish to send one, they would at once have become jealous and would have distanced themselves from them. In other words, if the Romans had demonstrated the least wish to send one, they would have. In other words, the Romans wanted to do this. They had to beg the Romans. If the Romans were willing to do that, then the Capuchins would have ran away from them. The fact that the Romans weren't trying to oversee them, then they turned to them. Right? This is this weird thing about this. They would have become jealous and would have distanced themselves from them. But what is needed is there. But what need is there to go to examples to Caputa in Rome, having them in Florence and Tuscany? We have tons of them locally. He said, everyone knows how much time it has been since the city of Pistoia came voluntarily under Florentine rule. Right? Again, this is his example 7. Since 1328, Florentine History is 2, chapter 30, right? Everyone also knows how much hatred, there has been between the Florentines and the Pisans, the Lucretius and the Sicilians. This difference of spirit has arisen not because the Pistoles do not prize their freedom, as do the others, and do not judge themselves as highly as the others, but because the Florentines have always comported themselves with them like brothers, but with the others like enemies. In other words, they want to control them. They treat them like brothers, the other ones they treat like enemies, and they want to control them. And therefore, you treat them like enemies, they return it in kind. This has made the Pistoli run willingly under their rule, while the others have exert all the force so as not to come under it. And without doubt, if the Florentines, by either of their laws or their aid, had tamed their neighbors and not made them savages, they would, without doubt, at this hour, be the lords of Tuscany. They're not. In other words, if the Florentines, by way of their laws or aid, had tamed their neighbors and not made them savages, they would be the lords of Tuscany. But this does not mean I judge their arms and force. This does not mean I judge that arms and force do not have to be put to work, but they should be reserved for the last place, where and when other modes are not enough. In other words, he's saying you shouldn't. I'm not saying that they're not necessary. He says that arms and force are useful, but they're not the thing you should use first. They should be reserved. He says last. This is where that famous line, violence. In other words, violence is the last resort of the incompetent. Right? That's the Asimov famous line. Machiavelli isn't saying that, but he's saying, listen, You don't use it's not. I don't mean to say that arms and force do not have to be put to work, but they should reserve for the last. Don't you know? He says last place. He says, when the other modes are not enough, the other modes should take precedent. If you can use the other modes, be friendly to them, encourage them, let them come to you. Come to you because they, in other words, have them rely on you, become dependent on you, but don't treat them like because the second you treat them like something you're gonna exploit or take, or you're too eager to control what they have, then they'll be jealous, right? And they'll resent it in that sense. Okay. So therefore, that's how we end this chapter. So if you like it, hit put your comments or questions in the thing, and I respond to them. And I really didn't like it, but if you have any comments or questions, please put them in there, and I'll respond to them when I see them. If you liked it, hit the like button. I mean, please hit the like button. It's good anyways. Help support the channel and like it. Another thing you can do is you can, if you liked it, share it on social media. Share it far and wide. Bring it to the attention of other people and friends and people think that we benefit from this, what we're doing here. And then another thing you can do is you're not subscribed, subscribe. Encourage others to come and check out the channel and subscribe. Help grow the channel. So by commenting, liking, sharing, subscribing, all of these, you increase the algorithm so that it will help people searching for like Discourses or Machiavelli. They'll find us, okay, and what we're doing here. Another thing you can do is you can, of course, if you didn't like it, you can always thumbs down, but say why in the comments so people can benefit. We're doing this for educational reasons. It makes most sense. So therefore, maybe someone who's going to watch this video and watch what we do here can benefit. Another thing you can do is, if you want to follow me on social media links below. If you want to know more about me as a scholar and as an academic, you can check out my scholarship and things like that at the academic social media links below, the social media links. And if you want to help me to do what I do, the links for Patreon or Subscribe Star are below, so you can help contribute to help what I do here. Another thing you can do is or another way you contribute is to simply buy one of my books that are listed. The available books are listed below, including the ebook. You can order your books either at a local bookstore, of course, but you can also order through an online distributor like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Libris, whatever, or directly through the publishers. And the ebooks, they're available. The ebooks there's one dedicated ebook by the publisher itself, Lulu, or directly through any of the online, Kindle or other places. And the other and some of the other books, the printed books, are also available as ebooks. So that's it. Hope you have a good day. Take care, and see you next time when we look at 21. Bye-bye.